I'm author and critic David Agranoff. I'm a horror and science fiction author, critic, and researcher. In this podcast, I wanted to provide in-depth interviews and panel discussions with everyone from New York Times bestselling authors to researchers, musicians, and anyone I find interesting. Welcome to Postcards from a Dying World. Hello and welcome to another special episode of Postcards from a Dying World. I have a very special guest today, and I'm very excited to talk about one of the coolest horror novels I've read in a while, and that's Forgotten Sisters by Cynthia and Pelayo. Is right? Am I pronouncing it?
Pelayo, you're close, but good. Yeah, Pelayo.
Okay. Well, my dyslexia makes it very hard for me to pronounce names a lot of times. So
Okay. It's okay.
I did the best I could. Senya, as you are known to your friends.
Cina.
Yeah.
Cina, yeah.
Cina, yeah, sorry.
It's okay.
I'm terrible.
We're figuring each other out. This is what we're doing. This is exciting. It's good.
Yeah. We met briefly at StokerCon, but I was already I had all your books on my want to read shelf on Goodreads, right? And they were already there. And then one of my favorite podcasts, Monster She Wrote, did coverage of this book, and I decided that I wasn't going to wait any longer. And thankfully, the library in my neighborhood had Forgotten Sisters on the new reads shelf. So I went home with it the first day I went looking for it, which was great. Awesome. So we're going to talk about this novel, and we're going to focus on it because unfortunately I haven't read the rest of your work, and I'm going to work my way back there. But this is your newest release, am I correct?
Yeah, this is my most recent release. And now that you said that you really liked this one, I think you're going to like the next one. So I'm going to send it to you as soon as I get copies so you can read the next one.
Hey, I'm all for it. But one of the reasons why I was so excited to read this book, I live in San Diego now, but as a Midwesterner, I grew up in Indiana. I went to high school in Illinois, so I spent time around Chicago. My sister lived in Chicago for 30 years, so I have a lot of connections to Chicago, and I love the city. So I was immediately sold on the concept of a horror novel that was like basically Chicago is one of the characters of the book. So one of the things that I want to say up front is, for those of you who love Chicago, have love for that city, that is one of the biggest selling points of Forgotten Sisters is the Chicago nature. But let's give my listeners an introduction into you as an artist. Like, how did you get into writing and horror, and how did you come to the point where this book was a part of your journey?
Oh, wow, that's a great question. I started as a journalist. So I grew up, I was born in Puerto Rico, but I grew up in inner city Chicago. And I always make that distinction in my bio and everywhere, inner city Chicago, because people will say they're from Chicago, but they're from like Naperville. And it's a very different culture. It's a very different type of identity. And so I grew up in the inner city. I still live in the same neighborhood, like a block away from where I grew up. And that's just a pretty important factor of who and what I'm like.
Chicagoland's a big area, so you can.
Yeah, I'm like a West Sider, so I'm on the northwest side. So I'm like West Side, more West, like, and I went to inner city schools. Grew up in a rough neighborhood. Gangs, guns, and drugs. I mean, were in my high school. I was part of the high school, and that was a lot of the fear was in that environment. And so I personally grew up in a very strict Catholic household. So it was like I was not allowed to leave the house. I was not allowed to like go beyond my house, my front steps. I was just very, very conservative Catholic. My father would drive me to the door of the high school, which is a block down. And so there's a lot. And so my parents were born in the rural Puerto Rico in the 1940s. So they were very superstitious people just because of the environment that they grew up in. Like they grew up in houses with like dirt floors and latrines. My mother said that the very first time she saw an airplane, she thought the world was ending. And her mother too. They had never seen an airplane, and they got on their knees and prayed. So these are the types of people that raised me.
Right.
And so very strict, very superstitious. They have sixth, and this is important in terms of my writing style, is my parents have sixth grade educations. And so they didn't really know how to read. And so what they could tell me were just fairy tales that they recall from whatever education that they received. So that was very important to them. And then my
Mm.
father, having a sixth grade education, he could read the newspaper. He could read the Sun Times, which was like the working man's newspaper, not the Tribune, because it was at the sixth grade level. And that was a part of my upbringing. It's like you wake up and you read the newspaper, you watch the news, you are informed. And so I went to high school, and my parents, well, my father particularly, was like, "You're going to go to college. We don't know how. Like, we're a military family as well." So he's like, "You're going to go to the military." I was supposed to go to the convent. Again, very conservative. Long story short, I
Right.
didn't go to the convent, wound up getting married, and I started studying journalism because my father was like, I think you can do journalism. You grew up knowing this. And so I worked in community reporting for a very long time, covering community news, and that included crime. And so I developed PTSD from a lot of the crime scenes that I saw, a lot of the things that I experienced from that. And then I just left one day when I
And that
saw,
drips off the page, by the way.
yeah,
And even in the one book that I read, like you can feel like the kind of lived in experience of that. Like,
yeah. And so, like, that's really part, that's a very roundabout way of saying, how did I get here? And so I had to leave report. I loved reporting, but it wasn't really paying the bills. Like I was getting a master's in marketing. I finished a master's in marketing, and that was my day job. And then at night I was a reporter, and I loved reporting because I was an old school newspaper reporter. That's what I wanted to do. But after one case that was very traumatic, I left, but I still wanted to write, and I didn't know what that meant. So I applied to the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and they rejected my application because they're like, your portfolio is journalism. This is a MFA in writing school. We're very fancy here. And I was just like, okay. And the chair called me, and this is back in the day when he was like, can you get in a cab and come down to the school and meet with me in my office? And I was just like, okay. And so I went, left my job right there and went down to his office. And he was like, what does a Puerto Rican girl from the hood want to do here? I was like, I want to write. It's your job. Like, you're a writing teacher. Like, teach me how to write. And he's like, what do you want? He's like, we don't do journalism. And I was like, I don't want to do journalism because I can't go back to that life, but I want to get this out. And he's like, okay, so I'm going to pair you with Jesse Ball, and I'm going to pair you with Ruth Margraf, and who's a playwright. So Jesse Ball writes fiction, and he's actually one of my favorite writers. And Ruth Margraf is a playwright. He's like, I'm going to pair you with them two, because they don't do genre. At that time, they weren't doing genre. I don't think anyone was doing genre. Everything was non-genre. And it was working with Jesse Ball, working with Ruth Margraf, who were like, you're a horror author who doesn't know she's a horror author, because I would just start writing, and then the supernatural just started weaving into my work. And I think
and that
I
was the
could,
influence of the fairy tales, right? Like,
yes,
yeah.
yes. And so Jesse Ball taught a class, like my second term there, Grimm's fairy tales. And the assignment was we had to read all of the Grimm's fairy tales twice, and then we would adapt them. So throughout the class, we would adapt. And then I also took detective fiction and a lot of courses in those types of areas. And so you take me growing up in a culture or an environment where it was an oral tradition of storytelling and journalism from my background, and then you mix it in with the academic of learning about detective fiction and then learning about the structure of fairy tales, and that's kind of where you get my style, where
Right.
it's a lot.
And
Yeah.
you get a lot of unique ingredients that, and one of the things that's so great about the how much horror fiction has changed since I first started reading it, right, is that we get a lot more authors that have these unique ingredients that
Yeah.
bring in to, that their novels, bring to their novels this unique perspective because, basically we had, Peter Straub, Stephen King, and all the people trying to be Stephen King. And there's nothing wrong with those guys. But,
Yeah.
to have something new and vital and different, I'm sure your teachers saw that, right? And we're trying to encourage you to.
Jesse Ball really encouraged me. He was just so like lovely because he was just like, you have to just what feels right. He's like, I don't know what feels right for you. He's like, you have to write what feels right for you. And at that time, he was, I mean, SAIC is still based on the critique method, but Jesse Ball's courses were not based on the critique method. It was he developed something called the asking method that I use in my teaching, where he encourages asking the author questions because only the author is going to know. You can get a million opinions about your work, but if you adjust your work to each and every person's opinion, it's not your work anymore. You have to know what it is you need to do. And so he was
Yeah.
very like helpful in helping me bring out the way I would structure things. And so I can write anything from it's very flat to anything that's very flowery. It really depends on the work. So I've done both.
Mhm. Well, yeah, and one of the things that it's kind of cool there too is that, you know a lot of us, like, Brian Keene or myself, we're all people who grew up reading Fangoria and reading Stephen King and like having these very direct horror trips, right? Or we watch horror movie hosts, right? And so it's cool to hear somebody like coming to this from a different perspective. I mean, did you have a shelf of horror novels like a lot of us do, or was this something, or did you have to learn the horror community as a writer?
I my I so I read a lot of fairy tales, obviously, and that's what we would get when we go to like the grocery store, the Aldi, the Dollar Bin. We would get me fairy tales. In terms of books, like I mean, we couldn't really afford books.
Mhm.
I so it was whatever I would get from school, and that would be tossed out from the library. And these were mostly like classics. So I read mostly was the classics. Is that what I
Yeah.
was reading? I didn't really start. I mean, I did. I loved horror, so I was always a horror fan. So since I was like 5, I would watch like every single horror movie. Like I was watching
Yeah.
like Hellraiser at like 9, and I mean, I was reading a lot comic books. I mean, that's probably where I would get my horror fiction. But in terms of like
Hmm.
the background, 'cause my dad could always get me. My dad, I loved comic books, so I would always get comic books. But in terms of like a lot of people have the history of like, oh, when I was 12, I read all the Stephen King novels, and I'm like, yeah, I don't think I can't remember, but I don't think I remember really heavily reading. I mean, a lot of Poe. I did read Shirley Jackson and everything by Ray Bradbury, but mostly what I was reading was classics. A lot of Shakespeare, um, whatever I can get free from the library. Yeah.
Right. Well, you know, for everything that it turned into, you came up, you've got this excellent mix of ingredients that make up the soup for what's interesting too. And I said this in I haven't posted my review yet for Forgotten Sisters, but I've written most of it. And one of the things that's interesting is that right after Pan's Labyrinth came out, there was this push in the publishing market where we're looking for like fairy tale inspired, horror novels. And I think a lot of people on the manuscript wish list, you saw a lot of people trying to chase this, and mostly to inauthentic results. And one of the things that I think is really great about this novel is that it feels so woven into the story. And it's one of the reasons why, but it's woven into these elements that you bring a lot of things to. In fact, like it's very, like, I did not know that about you, that you had this crime scene background, right? But now that I know this, it makes a lot of sense when I'm looking at Forgotten Sisters. So, My question with this novel is how many of these ideas have been floating around since that time that you were doing journalism?
Mm.
Because a lot of us, we sit on ideas for years and years and years until we're in the right space to write them, right?
Yeah.
So this one to me felt like a story you were just itching to tell for a long time. I don't know, am I correct, or is this a new idea?
You are correct. So I went through, so I went through like a very intense, like I want to say paranormal investigative phase in like the early 2000s. And I wrote this essay that was nominated for Stoker. That was called "I Want to Believe," and it was me. I was dealing with a lot of health issues at the time, and so I was questioning my belief system, and I was questioning my faith, and I was questioning, is anything here? Like, what is going on? And so I went through like this really intense paranormal stage, and that would include like visiting a lot of cemeteries, going to like haunted houses, haunted places, places that were purported to be haunted. I visited so many different places like Gettysburg, the Edinburgh Vaults, and I've never experienced anything, and I just kind of dismissed it all, and I started just becoming very like, there's nothing out there. And we went on a ghost tour, Chicago ghost tour. On, you see the the shuttles, and so I don't know. My husband and I one time, I don't know why, it was just we went on this Chicago ghost tour, and it took us to like the St. Valentine's Day massacre sighting. It was fun. It was very historical. Jane Addams Hall House to talk about the double baby. I'm like, yes, this is all great. And then we get to the Chicago River, and I'm like, I'm a Chicagoan, like through and through. Why are we here?
I see
And they
this river all the time, right?
why am I even here? And so they start telling us about the story of the SS Eastland. And I don't know why. I was just so overcome with emotion to learn that so many people died at this spot. And I didn't know about it. I was like, I know everything. Like I know all these Chicago things. Like how did I not know this? And I grabbed my husband's little Canon camera, and I just started taking pictures because the tour guide said, "Oh, sometimes you'll see orbs, and sometimes you'll see, people have reported seeing things." And so I took all these pictures, and I started going through the screen and zooming in. And when I found a face of a woman looking up from the water that looked like a woman, and I just remember everybody like I just gasped, and everyone on the tour kind of like stood around me, and they're like, "Yeah, that's a woman looking up at you from the water." And you could see like the face and the shoulders and all this white. And it was about 2005, and since then I had the story of I have to write this woman's story. It just kind of stuck in my head, that image, and I was of course skeptical, like, "Oh, it could have just been the light and the water and whatnot." But something just kept telling me, I think this is what you've been looking for, to tell you that maybe there is something there. So for multiple reasons, for my reestablishing what I was struggling with in terms of my faith, and then what I was struggling with in terms of like what I wanted to believe, I think it helped. And so I wanted to give back desperately to this thing that I felt like I connected with at that night. And I thought about it for a very long time until this book came.
Yeah, and there's I do want to say for people who are watching this before the spoiler warning that we're gonna get really into this, but if you have not read Forgotten Sisters yet, I will give a spoiler warning before we really get into the details. And but if you haven't already been sold to go get this book, then I don't know what's wrong with you. But we got a little bit more to talk about before we get into spoilers. And
Yeah.
you know, it's the history of these situations and Chicago as a character is one of the reasons why I connected to the book. My most recent book, People's Park, was the same thing. There was a park in my hometown of Bloomington, Indiana, that all the punks and freaks and weirdos hung out in, and I hung out there my whole childhood. And after like years of hanging out in this park, I read an article about how it had been a black owned business and the Klan bombed it. And I had no idea that I
Wow.
was hanging out in this spot. And there's a certain power to learning these histories that we as writers, when we learn these things, we want to spin these tales. And one of the reasons why Forgotten Sisters just really hooked me was because I felt as a writer when I was reading the story Unspooling, I could feel your desire to tell this story jumping off the page. And that might not be something that non-writers experience, but I think writers who are looking for connections to a book will really connect to that part of the story, because for me, there was this um, tragic history of these events that are woven into the story that just kind of help propel the story, because um, you want to see how these characters connect to these events from the past, in a way. And part of it is this haunting nature of how close Anna and Jenny um, live to the river,
Yeah.
and how connected these characters are to the river. So tell me about the modern part of the story, and like how you developed those parts of it, as spoiler free as we can get, and knowing that we're going to come back to it.
Well, I mean, so the idea was there since 2005, and it wasn't until recently that I finally heard them, and I heard the sisters, and it happened because I was doing. Well, we'll talk about that later, but I got the. I'll talk about that specific part later. But I started getting the voices of the characters, and it started off as, I think it was like a novella. Maybe it was like 80 pages or so, and it was just the two sisters engaged. It was very Shakespearean. It was like these two sisters just very like pontificating back and forth in these like long monologues about life and grief, and how they are not seen by the other, and they couldn't really like connect with one another across the space and time. So it's very like philosophical. And then I then started weaving it a little bit further and further, and I extended it to a novella that I was happy with, and I was ready to publish it as a novella, like just like a limited edition. And I believe it was my husband who was like, I think you have something here. I don't think it should just be like a limited edition. And I've done that with other works. I've had like little poetry books, and he's like, I think you need to expand this. And so I
Smart
started,
advice.
yeah. I mean, he reads everything I write. Everything I write it goes to, well, now it goes to my, like, he just like, but it goes to everything I write. It goes to like my husband, my editor, and my agent, and then I just kind of sit back and like shaking, like who's going to come back with feedback. That's usually how it goes. And so I've gotten to a point now where I don't share my writing throughout. I just finish it, and then I
Mm.
send it to them three, and then I cower in a corner for days. Um, but I went through several iterations of this. I extended it, and then I started then weaving in the detective parts.
Mhm.
Um, that's how it worked. And so there is a detective narrative throughout. And so what I did to write the detective, so we'll talk about my drafting process later, but I pulled out the detective parts, and then I would keep writing just those parts throughout. And then I would just focus on the sisters' parts throughout. So it's not like I would write the detective part and then jump into the sisters' part. Like if I was just working on the detective's voice, that's the only voice and headspace I wanted to be in. And I would just go throughout and work on all their sections as one. And once I was done with the detective parts, I split them up and I just chucked them, added them back into slotted them back into the novel.
Well, and what's cool about the way that this novel works together is that you have, the setting, and you have two parts of the setting that really make that kind of become characters in the novel, which is the city and the house. And um, how the house and the city and the river connects to the fairy tale aspect of it is a really neat kind of magic trick, a narrative magic trick, where it kind of weaves together. And then what makes it all like work is that you have like these kind of elements. And for me, Storytelling is parallels and reversals, and a lot of this novel is set up and payoff from that, uses elements of these three different parts of the novel to kind of come out to they all kind of come together in the end. And so these are all things that I'm telling people, like, before if you're still on the fence, these are the things that I think make this novel work and why you should want to read it. Before we get into spoilers, is there anything else for the people who are considering the book that you think I'm missing, that you feel are important elements of this book that you wanted to bring to the table, that you want readers to know you were working to get
Sure.
towards?
I think it's important for people to know, and I guess I didn't really explicitly say this, but I consider all of my works to be genre blending. And so
Mm-hmm.
I know I'm put in the bucket of horror, and well, that's fine and that's okay. But I've been trying to stress much more as of recent that my works are genre blending, and they have there's a various temperature throughout, and I'm always controlling the temperature of where is the horror element here, where is the mystery element here. And so it's exactly what you said in terms of how I layer my works. I layer them pretty heavily. And so you'll have the city, the house, the river, the sisters, detectives, the fairy tale, and the true crime. And it's important that when I am writing all of those themes, that they are balanced throughout.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, it's very well done. Now, this is something we usually do at the end of the podcast, but since we're about to go into spoilers, where's a really good place for people to find your work? And do you think this was my entry into your work, but do you think that there's a better entry? Like, did I make a mistake? Should I have read something else first?
I
Um,
Forgotten Sisters is a great place. I know a lot of people like Children of Chicago. I would say that Children of Chicago is my angriest book, and that deals with the fairy tale of the Pied Piper. It deals with inner city youth, gun and gang crime, and it was me getting out all of my anger of growing up in the inner city and seeing a lot of young people die that needlessly died. So I think Forgotten Sisters is very quiet and contemplative. So it depends what you're looking for.
hmm, okay. And pretty much any place books are sold, you can find them. Here in San Diego, I always recommend Mysterious Galaxy. I have definitely seen Forgotten Sisters on the shelf
Oh,
there.
that's
So,
cool.
and uh, yeah, so definitely, for my listeners, if you um, are new here, and if you're coming for senior, like you know I cover a lot of horror, and I like to see, and I'd like to, I love crime novels as well, and so I was actually kind of a tough customer, right? I didn't want to do the prove it to me bro kind of thing when I started reading it, but man, I really appreciated the different elements that you brought to this, and I was very
Thank you.
pleased.
Thank you so much. I love hearing that.
And it also made me feel like a complete, because I have had Children of Chicago on my want to read list since you announced it. And I felt like, what was I doing not having read this? So on that note, um, Forgotten Sisters, we are going to now talk process and
Cool.
spoilers. We're going to assume you've read it, so we're going to talk about it as if you've read it, so you have, this is your warning.
Yeah.
We're going to nerd out on process now.
Awesome.
Outliner or pantser? First question.
Strict outliner.
Me too.
Yes. Yes. That's cool.
Yeah,
All right.
I'm a structuralist, and I like books. I like when I know I'm in the hands of somebody who knows where the book's going. It's one of the reasons I don't like some later Stephen King. My all my favorite Stephen King books are the ones that have the ending baked in,
Uh,
like Misery or The Dead Zone. You know,
yeah.
yeah.
They're-
So tell me about your outlining process. Do you chapter by chapter? Do you thumbnail scenes? What do you do?
Chapter by chapter, scene by scene. So I create a map. I call it a map, and it is a Excel. I create this in Excel. So I write down the chapters all along down the side, and all across, I have a ton of different things. So I have things like I mark like the different acts, the different beats, where those are going to go. I also mark where I would traditionally think like a horror beat, because a horror beat is very different, where it would happen, how things would happen, mystery beat. And then at the very end, I will have, like these are on the columns, I will list out character, Little Mermaid. And each chapter, it's pretty one, and I would just start writing what would happen in chapter one. And then I start clicking off the check boxes. What would appear there? Well, chapter one, we're going to see the house. And in chapter one, we're going to see the sisters. In chapter one, there's going to be a touch point of the fairy tale. And then I would create another tab, and it's just chapter one. And I break it down like scene by scene. So it's very detailed. And I know a lot of people that don't outline, they feel like once you outline that you don't have any creative freedom. But I will write each day, and then I go back and kind of tweak, like you're pulling the levers, and I adjust the outline, and then I go back into the document.
No, I mean, just because you've looked at a map of a city doesn't mean you've seen the city, right?
Yeah.
Like, yeah. Yeah, I'm an outliner too. I do chapter by chapter, and I usually handwrite the first outline. And then the fluid outline is the one, then I'll eventually type it up. And that one, I can move things around. I can go back and change it. And usually every like 10 chapters, I go back to the outline and make sure, like, do I want to change things? Do I want to move things?
Yeah.
And yeah, that's how I do it. But um, I, every time I'm usually right, but a lot of times when I try to guess if somebody's a pantser or a structuralist or an outliner, I usually can guess it. And I did think you were an outliner because I felt like um, there's a certain rhythm that I think when you're doing various storylines and you're having like these elements that outliners do really well because they keep track of, I need to get back to this part of the story. I need to get back to that part of the story. Here I'm going to that. And one of the things I loved about Forgotten Sisters is there was a great rhythm between the various elements that are woven. And that's when you're weaving, I feel like you need that, right? You need that
Yeah.
rhythm. And I thought this novel was great for that.
Thank
So
you. And so once I complete the outline, I write what I consider my zero draft, because I think there's a lot of things that I feel like personally for me come out better faster, and it's my way of bypassing my consciousness so I can tap into the subconscious. So I will sit down and then just write the draft from beginning to end. Of course, in each day I kind of, do the tweaking of the outline, and then once I have that draft completed, my zero draft, nobody ever looks at that. But then I start rewriting it and layering and adjusting and finessing from there.
yeah, and so for me, what I do is that I always, whatever work I did the day before, I warm up by editing and reworking yesterday's work.
Yeah.
And to me, that I don't consider that I have like a first or zero draft, as you put it, until I do that next day. Because to me, that tweaking of yesterday's work is
Yeah.
actually my favorite part. That's what
Yeah.
I feel like. And then I feel like more prepared to write the next day because, or whatever, the next chapter, because I've spent some time fine tuning and getting back into the story.
Yeah.
Um, so let's get into some of the details about, so, um, again, we're in spoilers. So, what real crime scene stuff did you see that inspired this novel? Because I'm assuming it's the murder or the bodies and the intense
Yeah.
description of how the bodies decay in the Chicago River sounded like something you heard a lot about or knew something about.
I I heard a lot about. Was able to pull up a lot of crime scene photos. I mean, if you're a Chicagoan, you know cops are like everywhere, and so I know some people in law enforcement that I could ask questions, and I was able to see some photographs of what a drowned body looks like, and it's quite horrific. And then medical journals as well, so I was able to get my hands on some like medical journals, some documents about like an autopsy, because I did mention of autopsies. So I wanted to be as explicit, as painfully explicit as in terms of what a drowned body looks like. And the main reason I wanted to do this is because we read that in the headline, especially with the true crime case that I cover in the novel. I cover the multiple college age men that have been found drowned in the Chicago River. And you just hear young man found drowned. But
Yeah.
what does that mean? What does someone look like? What does a family member have to identify? And you turn into putty essentially when you're submerged in a body of water for that long.
So one of my buddies that we always talk about horror fiction, I was talking to him about this book, and um, he said something about he just read the back description, right? So, and he was like, well, why is it? He's like, oh, I'm so tired of characters being podcasters now. And he was like, I think I would have been better. He said, I think I would have been more into it if the character was a reporter writing newspaper articles. And I was like, no, 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 no. Here's why it was important in this novel that she be a podcaster, because her voice talking about the instances and her speaking about it is actually a part of the story. And I
Right.
told him I couldn't tell him why, but you know, we're in spoilers now, so we can talk about this. So, because there becomes this confusion of who's speaking in the last part of the book, because there's confusion about who
I
it,
see.
which sister it is, the voice and her relating the history is
Yeah,
important to the story. Or am I wrong? Because I felt like that was a crucial part of the story, that she
exactly.
she was talking about this history, right?
Exactly. And because it's funny they said that about the podcaster. That should have been a reporter. The next novel is a newspaper or a reporter of sorts. But this one,
Well,
there,
Anthony will definitely read that one then.
yeah. So there's a newspaper reporter. But this one, it had to be a podcaster for a few reasons. One, they you needed to hear their voice, and two, the Western Electric telephone. So there is the emphasis on the technology that used to be of the day, and the way people could, so communication, how people communicated was important. And so that was kind of part of it. I needed to show this kind of transition from Western Electric telephone and how you would communicate on a telephone to,
Yeah, and Anna had to be isolated. So
yeah,
you can be a podcaster sitting in a microphone by yourself and be isolated, because then that leads to her and connecting with Peter, the listener, and
yeah,
and all that. So she had to be isolated. If she was in a newsroom, it wouldn't have worked.
whatever.
So I was like, yeah, yeah, you're reading the back cover description. I've read the novel, so let me tell you where you're wrong. But and there are a lot of reasons why she had to be that, right?
Yeah.
She had to be in that position.
Isolation is, I've The next novel is much more intense in terms of isolation. I just love like an isolated character descent into madness storyline. But this isn't, it's kind of, it deals with some of that, but isolation is very intensely part of the makeup and the skeleton of the story.
So let's talk about the relationship of Anna and Jenny, because it started obviously as a novella about them.
Yeah.
So first of all, where, how do you feel like these characters came to be? And when did you decide, like, I'm going to connect them to pull did you have these other parts of the story for something else and then decided to bring them together? Or maybe that's too many questions at once.
They they are actually based on two sisters, Anna and Jenny Evenhouse, who died in the SS Eastland. So one day I was up late at night and I was just looking through. There's a lot of photographs about the Eastland, and I came across this picture of these two beautiful sisters, Anna and Jenny, and I was able then to find a picture of their grave and Anna and Jenny Evenhouse. And I think they were like, but they're in their early 20s. And I just thought about how sad it must have been that you work at this factory 6 days a week and you woke up one summer morning and you got dressed. I mean, these were Eastern European immigrants. And so this was like a big deal to go on this picnic. And so for a young woman to like at that time, this is 1915, to get dressed and put on your best clothes and to potentially go, this was a great place to meet a potential husband. In 1915, this is what it was, right? And so to think of them getting dressed that morning and being so pretty and drowning, it just broke my heart. And so I wrote this for them, and I wrote this for all of them, all of the 800 people plus that died in the SS Eastland, but particularly for these two sisters who they became the
Yeah.
story for.
And that's a heck of a lot of people to die on a river. Basically, yeah. I mean, yeah, it's
Accident because
yeah,
to be docked there and to capsize and trap, it's a freakish, completely freakish accident.
yeah,
Well, negligence. Right.
yeah. And so weaving that story with the murders the murders part of the crime part of the story. um I mean, you kind of, I'm assuming you had these desperate bits and then you were like, oh, now you probably figured out a way to combine them, right? Or at what part in the process did you start seeing them as one story?
I don't remember the exact point, but I just remember thinking the water was going to be a major element of this because of the river. And it was really important that I dealt with, like, the house was going to be very important to me as well. But it just didn't feel finished because this is before the detectives came in. I was like, this needs to be a detective story as well. And I believe it was like one of these mornings when, we got another alert that a body was found, a young man drowned in the Chicago River. And I was like, I think that's it. And it clicked then finally, the fairy tale that it would tie this to. I was like, this is the Little Mermaid. And in the Hans Christian Andersen little version of Little Mermaid, I mean, the Little Mermaid dies at the end. It's a tragedy. And I was like, this is perfect. And so all my elements like got plugged in once I figured out the true crime piece.
Yeah, yeah, and it all makes sense now. When now, and I admitted this to you before we started recording, and my longtime listeners will know, I am very hard to impress with first person. I am not a fan of first person narratives. I prefer third person at all times, and especially because in multiple shifting point of views,
Yeah.
it's hard for me. I'm always like, well, why is this person suddenly the I and this person not? So I admit the first time the point of view switched, I groaned. I rolled my eyes in my chair and I was like, oh no, I'm not going to like this. And I feel terrible because I like the author. And then I was like, well, I'm going to keep reading. And one of the best things is for me when a first person narrative wins me over, I forget about it, right? I completely forget about it. And I did in this book. And there was only one other time that I remembered it. And then I started to also do like, oh no. And then I realized what you were doing. And then I went, see, I know what she's doing. And that is when the blurring of the lines happens between Anna and Jenny. And then I realized because one of my complaints a lot of times with first person is there's most of the time there's no good reason why authors are writing in first person, and there's no reason for the book to be in first person. But this book has a reason to be in first person because once the lines get blurred and it's confusing on purpose, right?
Yes. Yes.
And who's talking? And then the most genius elements of the writing in this novel are when I'm confused. I'm like, whoa, wait, who's talking here? Wait, I thought this was the other sister. And then I'm like, and then I had a moment. I was sitting in this chair right here reading the book, and
Yeah.
I sat there and I was like, oh, she got me.
I
Good
love it.
job.
I
Yeah.
love it. So you have to, okay, so I get a lot of people that get really mad at my writing, and they're always like, her writing's too confusing. I don't know what's happening. If I'm not challenging myself as an author with structure and form and breaking what we think a novel should be, then I'm not going to be happy. And so when I went into this, I knew what was going to kind of happen. Um, we'll talk about this in a little bit, but the ending was actually different originally. The flip was a little different originally. And but I like to say this one, and many of my books are like, well, especially this one, it feels like it's a like a it's a fever dream, but it's like your Alice in Wonderland. It's like there's this Alice in Wonderland effect where you don't really know what's going on, and you think it's just confusing for the sake of being confusing, and then everything just starts getting slotted together, which I think is the exciting payoff.
Yeah. And I say this in all the right ways, but there were times where I sat there and was like, no, no, this is not working. And then but I pushed through and then I was like, okay, now I see what you're doing. And actually I appreciated the book more for that because you're right. It is challenging. I and just as a fan of the novel, I worry that um, some readers are not sophisticated enough to get what's being laid down. You can't say that. I can say that. And so on behalf of only myself, I say that was a very sophisticated twist.
Thank you.
And the fact that I didn't think it was working for a good 15, 20 pages is actually one of the things that works best about it.
Yes.
And um, there will be people who will put the book down and be like, nope, at that point.
Mm-hmm.
And
A
I
lot.
admit that
Yeah.
they're wrong. They're wrong
You
because
have
it,
to.
it comes through. And so I just want you to know I got that. I got that. And I'm actually afraid to look at the Goodreads reviews because I had the thought as I was
Which
reading
one?
that there are
I
going to be there are going to be people who don't get this, who
I was
can't
so
live with
confused.
this.
And I never look at I don't look at my reviews. I only ever look at, say, maybe like the first five, just because I want to make sure that there wasn't like a major catastrophe, like the editor uploaded the wrong manuscript and they're like, there's like a
Right?
pumpkin. Like, that's not the
That
book.
did
What happened?
happen to me once. That
You
did
see,
happen to me
that's
once.
why always I think nobody should ever look at the reviews, but take a look at the first couple just to make sure the publisher upload. You never know, and
Yeah.
so a lot of, I mean, I think you have to.
Well,
it
I'm not suggesting you do that, but I'm
yeah,
telling you because I know what you mean. I have thick skin, so if I read something that I think
yeah,
somebody got wrong, I'm like, whatever.
yeah.
I mean, you have to have thick skin to do this, but
You have
what?
to.
Yeah,
Good life.
yeah, and and the whole but my point being is that uh that was that was a bold part of the narrative that I can just see that certain people aren't going to get it. And it's like, when the Crying Game came out, there were certain, for example, there were certain people when that twist came that just were like, and I just pulled Crying Game out of random like movie with a twist, that there were people that were just like, nope, nope, can't do that movie. It right. And but that happens sometimes when people take
Love a good twist.
bold choices with the book, and I do think it's a bold ending, and it's a big part of the thumbs up for me. And it's funny because in my head a lot of times as a reviewer, I'll be thinking when I'm reading it like, okay, well, this is a 4-star book, this is pretty good. And then and sometimes there's moments where you go, oh, that's a 5-star book, and that's what changed it, and that's what did it. And for me, um it really brought everything together. And
Thank you.
what's great about it is it's paying off the structure. It's the setup and the payoff, right? And that's one of the things as a structurist I love, because if you can, set up a book that um, that pays off everything, then sometimes it doesn't matter what happens before it. Not that I didn't enjoy the parts before, but what I'm
Yeah.
saying is that I just really love that part of the ending. So let's talk about that because we're in spoilers.
Yeah.
The confusion was important. Anna lost her sister,
Yes.
and so you said you had a different ending. What was the different ending
The
at one point, and did that come to you in second draft, or when did you change the ending?
the ending was changed by the publisher. So once we sold the book, they were like, "We love the book, but you can't kill everyone at the end." So in the original ending, everybody was a ghost except
Mm,
for the detectives. And so the
yeah.
detectives realized, and everybody died. Um, Kowalski died. Like the sisters are ghosts. And give me 1 second. My mom is calling.
That's okay. I'll pause. We were talking about changing the end, and then we had a
A
phone call
child.
from the child. Yeah. So uh,
So I mean that's what happens when you have children. They'll just call you and be like,
yeah.
"Where are you? What are you doing? I'm on a podcast." Oh, so the in the original ending, and Anna, Jenny, and Peter were ghosts. They were all ghosts from the Eastland, and so the detectives were really confused there at the end, and the publisher thought that they loved the book and they were just like, we love everything, but you have to change the ending. Um, they cannot all be ghosts because it would be. I mean, they thought it would be upsetting to like a general reader, and so I was like, okay, let's see. And they were like, the one that should be a ghost is Jenny. And then I stepped back and I thought about it. And I was like, you're right. It should be Jenny. And so I thought it became much more exciting then
Yeah.
to so I had to go in and refinesse a lot of the dialogue and a lot of the interactions because if you go back and you start I believe I gave a hint that Jenny was dead on page 4, so there is a
Mm.
clue. And I remember when we were going through the final edits, the editor circled it, and they were like, "We see. You want to keep this spoiler?" I was like, "Yes." I can't remember what it was, but I think she said "I was," or she said something in the past. But there is a
I'm looking now.
there was something really early on, and one of Jenny's early, or maybe it was Anna said she was, or there was a was there. There was a past tense. And we kept that for any really sophisticated reader. And only one reader has caught that. They were like, oh, Jenny's a ghost because of this page. And so, yeah, I had to finesse a lot more. And I think it came out beautifully. This, and it felt more tragic for Anna, I think.
Yeah, that she's got this well, and it's funny too because what I think, you know, we all can imagine like what it would be to lose somebody that's that important to us and not be able to let go, right?
Yeah.
And so like um and that's, you know, and one of the cool things, another thing that we have in common is I love titles that have multiple meanings,
Yeah.
right? And and you know, some of the uh you know, some of the things that about this novel that really kind of resonates for me is you know, this tragedy, what it does is it makes the novel have like, you know, the macro and the micro tragedy, right? And you know, like I said, I believe storytelling is parallels and reversals, and the parallels throughout this story are the micro and macro tragedies, right? And it's one of the things that makes this novel, you know, really work. Um, so lastly, so you've given us a lot of really cool looks under the hood. In fact, uh, this is the thing that I love doing with this is I love talking about process with writers. It's so fun. Uh, and partially like it's fun to see you know, one of the things that I think is so great about this novel for me as a structuralist is to just um I just felt like I was in awesome hands the whole time, like until that moment when you kind of shook me up, and then I realized I was in good hands, and that was one of the neat narrative tricks. So did I miss any narrative magic tricks that we need to talk about, ones that um that were important to what you were doing here? Like I feel like sometimes you know, like on my novel Last Night to Kill Nazis, I, you know, on the surface, it's like vampires killing Nazis, right? Like, and I wanted to write before I released the title, I kept telling everyone it was a Holocaust revenge novel, right? And there were a lot of elements of that novel that I think gets lost in the pulp idea of the vampires killing the Nazis. And I think some people here will miss some of the elements of this because they'll be like, oh, it's a ghost novel, it's a fairy tale, you know, whatever. But I think there's elements of Chicago. You're speaking to the underground or the politics of that city in a way that might be missed, right? So are there elements of Chicago that you were really trying to express, kind of social political elements of Chicago?
I think there were a lot of social political elements throughout the novel that I was trying to. I don't like heavy handed things. I don't think any of us really want things that are really heavy handed. But I think there's a few things I try to do. Like I tried to do this compare and contrast throughout very lightly between the Titanic and the SS Eastland. Everybody romanticizes the Titanic, and I think it's particularly because millionaires and billionaires died on this vessel. But the SS Eastland, these were Eastern European immigrant factory workers. And this is one of the largest maritime disasters in US history. So not only is it not known widely in Chicago, it's just not known widely throughout the United States. And I think that this is a massive American tragedy. Also, this is a tragedy because of corporate greed. And so nobody ever paid or any consequences for all of these people dying. And I would argue the reason that happened is because they were immigrants. And because they were immigrants, it was like, sweep this under the rug. Nobody talk about it. Everybody ignore it. And we see that today with immigrants throughout the United States when there's like this, large scale deaths of immigrants, maybe coming up into the US from other areas, that we want to, for people try to forget about these things. And there wasn't a marker commemorating the spot where the Eastland disaster happened until just recently. So the compare and contrast, the immigrant, uh, the idea of just these people, that there was 800 plus people that died, 22 entire families. And so this idea of like legacy, 22, I believe, what was it, Hallis survived, and was it isn't he the one that like set up like the National Football League? Like he was like a survivor of the SS Eastland. And so it's like this one person that could have died in the SS Eastland has like this amazing legacy that extends throughout people's lives and generations. What would have I just kind of think it's so tragic because so many people were lost and just forgotten. And so those are a few things that I tried to cover not so heavy-handedly.
Well, Cina, you are taking your place in the horror lexicon as far as, first of all, you're a Bram Stoker award-winning author, and that's amazing in its own right. But you're taking your place in the map of horror in the sense that Stephen King has Maine, Josh Malerman has Michigan, and I I think what you're doing for Chicago is awesome. As a person who loves that city, visited that city a lot, saw a lot of great shows in Chicago, so I have a lot of, growing up in Indiana, I, you know, it was a 5 hour drive from my hometown to Chicago, and my sister lived in Oak Park,
Cool.
and yeah, and so and I also my mom's twin sister was way up north in Deerfield,
Yeah.
and so as a kid, between my roommate being from Chicago, he lived in Hyde Park.
Cool.
His
Yeah. Cool.
parents were
So,
professors at University of Chicago. I spent a lot of time in the city. The city means a lot to me, and I'm glad that I will have more books to read in this city, from the ones that you have already written and the ones you are writing. I
thank you.
should have asked you about this before spoilers, and I
Yeah.
forgot. But
Okay.
if we want to talk a little bit before we go about what's next, I would love to hear, and I think the listeners would love to hear just a taste of what you're working on. I know you can only say so much, but
Sure. So the next novel is titled Vanishing Daughters. And while Forgotten Sisters, it's very similar in Forgotten Sisters in that there's a fairy tale, a true crime case, and perhaps in that one an urban legend. So where in Forgotten Sisters the fairy tale that influences it is The Little Mermaid. The next one, Vanishing Daughters, it's Sleeping Beauty. It deals with a serial killer that is murdering many women throughout the south side of Chicago, and it also deals with Chicago's most famous urban legend, our most famous ghost. And if you know who I'm talking about, you know who I'm talking about. So
very
I can't
cool.
spoil it too
Um,
much.
yeah, and I will take you up on the offer of an early copy because
Yes, send it to you. I think you'll, especially since we didn't talk too much about first person, but especially since you really like that you don't really click with first person, it was really great to hear that I was able to kind of
right.
captivate you with this. So hopefully the next one you'll like as well.
Brian Keene and I had a really hilarious conversation once about first person because he writes a lot of first person, and we had a really hilarious back and forth about like the pros and cons of first person. And I uh, I have I have the reputation of immediately like people like, oh, you're gonna hate this. It's in first person, and it's not true. I can be won over. And there are two instances I use to explain where I think are super great examples of first person where you don't cheat, which is
Yeah.
Dolores Claiborne and Stephen King's Later, are because one of the things is that he never cheats on, you know, like how in found footage films they always come up with excuses for why people are talking about things they would never talk about. What
Yeah.
I love about Dolores Claiborne is it's an interview, it's an interrogation, and it never breaks like the reality of where it's at. And that's why I think that's a great first person. What
Yeah.
I really loved about Forgotten Sisters and where I think you used it to the advantage of the book was that confusion and where the reveal in the final act.
Mm.
And so yes, you won me over on that. Malerman recently did that with incidents around the house because I thought he could never keep that up for the whole book, and
Yeah.
and he did. And you know, we talked about it here on this podcast, he and I, and I still can't believe he pulled it off for a whole novel. And it's one of those things with writers. It's really cool when they do that. Um, so on that note, is there any last things you want to say about Forgotten Sisters? Uh, I appreciate people made it this far. If they made it this far, you love the book, and I'm really glad you did. And anything else you want to say?
No, just thank you for having me. Thank you for talking process. That was a lot of fun.
Yeah, that's what I do here. I love to talk process. If you made it this far too, the other thing I want to shout out to people again. One of the major projects that I've got going on the side right now is the Catherine Lucille Moore project. And so, for listeners who made it this far, also a Midwest horror writer and a woman, but she was doing it in the 1930s. And the building where she worked in the 30s and sent all of her stories to Weird Tales in the mail is now a Hilton Hotel in Indianapolis. And the mail slot she sent all of her stories and her letters to H.P. Lovecraft is still there in that hotel lobby. I'm trying to get a plaque put up there. So, people, I have an article on amazingstories.com about this Catherine Lucille Moore project, and people can find out ways to support that effort. But it's about honoring the tradition of Midwestern horror writers who are women. And C.L. Moore was she was writing freaky, like weird body horror, weird sex tentacle stories in the 1930s. People, she was awesome. Uh,
Right.
a product of the Great Depression in Indiana, and so it's a very cool thing. So I want to put a shout out to people that you don't have to do anything for the project, but I want people to read CL Moore. So I just want to put it out there, and you can find she has a book called Northwest of Earth that everyone should read. So I just want to shout that out. And on that note, folks, the next interview in the pipeline is likely going to be Sarah Langan talking about a better world. And that is coming up soon as well. And then Johnny Compton talking about Devils Kill Devils. So keep your eye out for those interviews. They are coming up soon. And I appreciate your time. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Last words?
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in.
Yeah, this was awesome. Great book. And we'll talk next time, folks. Thank you.